In 1998, a box of old photos was found in an attic. They showed a little girl who had vanished from that same house 6 years earlier, playing with a man no one had ever seen before. The story really began back in 1992, on a humid August night. 8-year-old Lily was tucked into her bed by her mother, Sarah. Her father, Tom, had checked the lock on her window, a habit he'd formed ever since they moved into the 2-story house on the quiet, tree-lined street. He'd kissed her forehead and whispered, "Sleep tight." It was the last thing he ever said to her. The next morning, Sarah went to wake her for breakfast, but the room was empty. The bed covers were neatly pulled back, as if she had simply gotten up and walked away. But her little slippers were still placed perfectly beside the bed. She wouldn't have gone anywhere without them. A chill ran through Sarah that had nothing to do with the morning air. Then she saw the window. It was wide open, the white curtains dancing in the breeze. Tom swore he had locked it. He always did. He ran to it and looked down at the soft soil of the flower bed below. There, pressed into the dirt, were 2 sets of footprints. One set was small, barefoot, Lily's. The other was large, deep, and made by a heavy work boot. They led from beneath the window, across the lawn, and to the sidewalk, where they vanished. It was as if she and the stranger had simply dissolved into the morning fog. The police came, their calm, professional manner doing nothing to soothe the screaming panic in Sarah's chest. They searched the room, the house, the yard. They found nothing. No signs of a struggle, no ransom note. Nothing was taken, nothing was disturbed, except for a single girl who was gone. The days that followed blurred into a nightmare of news crews on the lawn and volunteers searching the nearby woods. Her face was on every telephone pole and in every newspaper. Lily, with her bright, gap-toothed smile and big brown eyes. "Have you seen this child?" The question hung in the air of the town for months, a ghost that never settled. The police interviewed everyone, neighbors, teachers, distant relatives. No one had seen anything. No one had heard a thing. The man with the work boots was a phantom. The trail went cold almost as soon as it began, leaving behind only the deafening silence in Lily's empty room. Her parents left it untouched. Her dolls sat on the shelf. Her drawings were still taped to the wall. It was a perfect, heartbreaking museum of a life that had been stolen in the middle of the night. For 6 years, that was all they had. The silence, the questions, and a room full of memories. They lived in a state of suspended grief, unable to move on, unable to accept. Every knock on the door, every ringing phone, was a spike of hope and terror. But the call they waited for never came. The weight of Lily's absence pressed down on the house, on the marriage, on everything. Sarah and Tom found themselves moving like ghosts through their own lives. They'd pass each other in the hallway and not speak for hours, each lost in a private sea of guilt and sorrow. Tom would stand in the doorway of Lily's room, his hand on the frame, just staring. He'd trace the scuff marks on the floor where she used to play with her toy cars, the faint crayon marks she'd made on the wall behind her dresser. He replayed that night over and over in his head. Did he check the lock? He was sure he did. He always did. But what if, just that one time, he had forgotten? What if he was the reason the window was open? The thought was a poison, seeping into every moment of his day. Sarah spent her time cleaning. She'd scrubbed the floors until her knees ached, washed the windows until they gleamed, as if she could wipe away the event itself. But no matter how clean the house was, it always felt dirty, tainted by what had happened. She stopped seeing friends. The pity in their eyes was too much to bear. The way they'd talk about their own children, their small, everyday complaints, felt like a knife twisting in her gut. The town that had once rallied around them now felt like a cage. People would look away when she walked by, their whispers following her down the street. "The house on the corner," they'd say. the one where the little girl disappeared. After 3 years, a detective came to their door. He was a kind man, his face etched with tired sympathy. He told them the case was now considered cold. It didn't mean they were giving up, he assured them, but resources had to be moved to active cases. There were no new leads, no new information, nothing. That was the day Tom and Sarah finally accepted that they couldn't stay. The house was no longer a home, it was a tomb. Every corner held a memory that hurt. Lily's swing set in the backyard, slowly rusting. Her height chart, marked in pencil on the kitchen doorframe, ending abruptly at the age of 8. They sold the house for a loss to a young couple who didn't ask too many questions. They packed up their lives, taking only a few of Lily's things: a favorite teddy bear, a box of her drawings, the last school photo taken of her. They moved to a small apartment across the state, hoping that distance would somehow lessen the pain. But it didn't. Grief was portable. It came with them, a heavy, invisible suitcase they could never set down. They never spoke of Lily to their new neighbors. They tried to build a new life, but it was a hollow construction, built on a foundation of loss. For another 3 years, the silence continued. The world moved on. But for Sarah and Tom, time had stopped in 1992, on a hot August night when a window was left open. In the summer of 1998, 6 years after Lily vanished, Mark and Jenny Peterson were making the house their own. They had bought it for a good price, aware of its sad history but determined to fill it with new, happy memories. They painted the walls, planted a garden, and soon the sound of their own toddler's laughter echoed in the halls. The house felt warm again. But there was one place they hadn't touched: the attic. It was a small, dusty space, accessed by a rickety pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling. The previous owners had left a few old boxes up there, and Mark had been meaning to clear them out for months. One sweltering Saturday afternoon, he finally decided to tackle the job. He pulled down the ladder, the old wood groaning in protest. Armed with a flashlight, he climbed into the darkness. The air was thick and stale, smelling of old wood and forgotten things. Dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight like tiny stars. The attic was mostly empty, save for a few forgotten Christmas decorations and 3 cardboard boxes pushed into a far corner. 2 were filled with old newspapers and magazines. He dragged them toward the ladder, ready to haul them down to the trash. But the 3rd box was different. It was smaller, a simple shoebox, sealed with a single piece of yellowed tape. It felt light. Curiosity got the better of him. He sat on the dusty floorboards and peeled back the brittle tape. The cardboard lid came off with a soft sigh. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like old cotton, was a stack of Polaroid pictures. He picked one up. It was a photo of a little girl with a gap-toothed smile, sitting on a floor, playing with colorful plastic blocks. She looked happy. He recognized her instantly from the stories the older neighbors had told. It was Lily. A strange feeling, a mix of sadness and unease, settled over him. Why would her parents leave something like this behind? He flipped to the next photo. It was Lily again, this time at a small table, drawing with crayons. But she wasn't alone. In the corner of the frame, partially in shadow, was a man. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, just watching her. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He had never seen this man before. He was older, maybe in his 40s, with thinning hair and a plain, forgettable face. He wasn't smiling. His expression was flat, unreadable. Mark's heart began to beat faster. He shuffled through the rest of the photos. There were about 20 in total. Lily drawing, Lily playing with a doll, Lily reading a book, and in almost every single one, there was the man. Sometimes he was just a hand on her shoulder, sometimes a blurry figure in the background. In one photo, he was kneeling beside her, his face close to hers, pointing at something in her book. He looked like a father, a relative, an uncle. But the police had said she was with a stranger. Mark felt a cold dread creep up his spine. This wasn't just a box of old memories. This was something else. This was evidence. He looked closer at the photos. The room they were in, the floral wallpaper, the white dresser, the small window with the tree outside. It was the room right below him, Lily's old bedroom. These pictures were taken inside this house. He called down to his wife, his voice tight. "Jenny, you need to come up here. You need to see this." Jenny climbed the ladder, her face clouded with concern at the strange tone in her husband's voice. When she saw the photos spread out on the dusty floor, she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Who is that?" she whispered, pointing a shaky finger at the man in the pictures. Mark shook his head. "I have no idea. But look at this." He handed her a specific photo. It was slightly different from the others. Lily wasn't smiling. She was looking away from the camera, her eyes wide, staring up at the ceiling, as if she was listening for something, or someone. Right above her, in the attic where they now sat, the implication hit them both at the same time, a wave of nausea and fear. This man hadn't just been in her room. He had been documenting his time with her, and he had left the proof behind. Jenny backed away from the box as if it were radioactive. "We have to call the police," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Now, the call was made, and the quiet Saturday afternoon was shattered by the arrival of sirens. 2 patrol cars were followed by an unmarked sedan. Out of it stepped a man who looked older than his years, his shoulders slumped with a familiar weight. It was Detective Miller, the original lead investigator on the Lily case. He had retired 2 years prior, but the dispatcher knew to call him. This case had haunted him, a permanent stain on his career and his conscience. He walked into the house, his eyes scanning the familiar layout. He remembered every detail from 6 years ago. When Mark showed him the photos, Miller's face went pale. He sank onto the living room sofa, spreading the polaroids out on the coffee table. He stared at them for a long time, his jaw tight. For 6 years, they had imagined a monster grabbing her from the window and disappearing into the night. A quick, violent act, but this was something else entirely. This was calculated, patient. The man in these photos wasn't a fleeting shadow. He was an intimate observer. He had been in her space, breathing her air, watching her play. The photos felt like a violation all over again. Miller looked up at Mark and Jenny. "Where exactly did you find these?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "In the attic," Mark said. In an old shoebox. Miller's gaze drifted upward toward the ceiling. The attic. The one place they had only given a cursory glance 6 years ago. It was small, cramped, and full of insulation. They had swept a flashlight beam across it, seen nothing of interest, and moved on. The thought that the answer could have been up there, all this time, was like a physical blow. The investigation, once cold and dead, was suddenly, violently alive again. Miller called for a full forensic team. He didn't want a cursory glance this time. He wanted that attic taken apart, piece by piece. He looked back at the photos, at the man's bland, forgettable face, a face that had been hiding in plain sight. Then he focused on Lily. In some photos, she looked happy, engaged, as if playing with a trusted friend. In others, there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, a confusion, a wariness. In the one where she looked at the ceiling, it was outright fear. Who was this man? And how had he gained her trust enough to take these pictures right under her parents' noses before snatching her away forever? The questions were the same as 6 years ago, but now they had a face to attach them to. A face that was smiling faintly in one of the last pictures, as if he knew he was holding a secret no one would ever uncover. The forensic team descended on the house, turning the quiet suburban street into a hub of activity. They sealed off the attic, treating it like a fresh crime scene. Under the harsh glare of portable floodlights, the dusty space was transformed. Every inch of the floorboards was vacuumed for fibers, every surface dusted for prints. Detective Miller stood in the hallway below, watching them work, a bitter taste in his mouth. He thought of Sarah and Tom, of the call he would have to make. For 6 years, he had nothing to offer them but condolences. Now, he had something real, something tangible. But he knew this discovery would not bring them peace. It would only open up old wounds and introduce a new, more horrifying narrative. What they found in the attic was worse than they could have imagined. Tucked away under a loose section of insulation near the eaves, they found a small, makeshift nest. A flattened cardboard box served as a mattress. Beside it were several empty water bottles and a small pile of candy wrappers and cracker packages. The brands were generic, cheap. There was also a small, rusted can filled with dozens of cigarette butts. He had been living up there. The realization settled over the team with a sickening weight. He hadn't just come in through the window on that one night. He had been there for days, maybe even weeks, living in the ceiling right above the family, listening, watching. The creaks and groans the family had dismissed as the house settling were him, shifting his weight just a few feet above their heads. He would have heard them talking at the dinner table. He would have heard them tucking their daughter into bed. The thought was monstrous. He had turned their family home into his own personal observation deck. The forensic analyst called Miller over. He pointed to a small crack in the floorboards, directly over Lily's bedroom. It had been deliberately widened, just enough for someone to peer through. He could have watched her sleep. He could have listened to her breathing. The polaroids now made a terrifying kind of sense. They weren't taken on a single occasion. They were a collection, a scrapbook of his secret time with her. But how did he get in and out of the room without her parents knowing? Then one of the officers found it. Scratches on the inside of Lily's bedroom closet. At the back of the closet, a panel of wood had been cleverly loosened. It led directly into the wall cavity, which connected to the attic crawlspace. He didn't always use the window. He had built his own private entrance into her room. He could come and go as he pleased. Lily would have been the only one who knew. This explained the look in her eyes in some of those photos. She wasn't just playing with a new friend. She was keeping a secret that probably terrified her, a secret she was likely told never to share. He was probably her special friend, the man who lived in the walls. A child wouldn't understand the danger. She might even have found it exciting, a fairy tale come to life. A man only she could see. The team continued their search, their movements slow and deliberate. They found a few strands of hair caught on a nail near the nest. Not Lily's. They belonged to the man. They also found a partial fingerprint on one of the water bottles, miraculously preserved in the dry, still air. It was more than they had in the entire original investigation. Miller stared at the small pile of evidence bags. Hair, fingerprints, cigarette butts. These were the ghost's belongings. After 6 years of silence, the man in the attic had finally started to speak. The next step was the most difficult. Miller drove to the small apartment where Sarah and Tom now lived. He had rehearsed the words in his head, but when Sarah opened the door, her eyes immediately filled with a familiar, guarded hope, and the words caught in his throat. He sat with them at their small kitchen table, the same way he had 6 years ago. He laid out the facts gently, clinically. The new family, the attic, the box. Then he pushed a single photograph across the table. It was one of the clearer shots of the man, his face unobscured. "Do you know him?" Sarah stared at it, her hand trembling as she picked it up. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. Tom took the photo from her, his face a mask of stone. He studied the bland features, searching for any flicker of recognition. Nothing. He was a complete stranger. A stranger who had been living in their ceiling, who had made a secret door into their daughter's bedroom. The horror of it washed over them, fresh and sickening. All those nights they had slept, thinking she was safe in her bed, while he was just feet away. The weight of Tom's guilt intensified. The unlocked window hadn't been a one-time mistake. It had been an invitation the man no longer even needed. Miller then showed them the other photos. Sarah let out a choked sob, seeing Lily's face, so alive, so real. But seeing her with that man, in her own room, was a new kind of torture. It felt like watching a home movie made by a monster. The police, meanwhile, were working around the clock. The fingerprint from the water bottle was run through the national database. They got a hit. The man's name was Arthur Hayes. He was a drifter with a minor criminal record stretching back 20 years. Loitering, petty theft, trespassing. A string of small crimes that never hinted at the darkness he was capable of. There were no violent offenses, no crimes against children. He was an expert at staying just under the radar. The last entry on his record was from 1991, a trespassing charge in a town 50 miles away. After that, he had fallen off the map. They released his photograph to the media. Not the Polaroid, but an old mugshot from his last arrest. The face was gaunt, the eyes empty, but it was unmistakably the man from the attic. The tip lines lit up. This time, the calls were different. They weren't just vague sightings. Several people from Lily's old neighborhood called in. They remembered him. An elderly woman who lived down the street said he had done yard work for her in the summer of '92. He was quiet, she said, kept to himself. But she remembered him watching the neighborhood kids play. She had thought it was odd, but he seemed harmless. Another neighbor remembered seeing him walking down the street late at night, but had dismissed him as just someone out for a stroll. He had been there, hiding in plain sight, a phantom everyone saw but no one truly noticed. He had studied the neighborhood, the houses, the families. He had chosen Lily. The investigation now had a name, a face, and a history. But it also had a terrifying new dimension. Arthur Hayes hadn't just been a passing predator. He had been a resident predator, embedding himself into the very structure of their home, turning their sanctuary into his hunting ground. The question was no longer just who took Lily, but where had he taken her after he finally decided to leave his nest in the attic for good. With a name and a face, the investigation gained a desperate momentum. Detectives traced Arthur Hayes' life, trying to build a picture of the man who lived in the walls. He was a ghost, moving from town to town, working odd jobs for cash, never staying in one place for long. He had no family, no friends, no connections. He was a man who specialized in being forgotten. They tracked his movements before 1992. They found a pattern. In at least 3 other towns, he had been arrested for trespassing near homes with young children. Each time, he was given a small fine and told to move on. No one had ever connected the dots. No one had seen the quiet, lonely man for the patient predator he was. But the trail went cold after Lily's disappearance. It was as if Arthur Hayes had vanished from the face of the earth, just as she had. Had he taken her somewhere and started a new life? Was she still alive? For a brief, agonizing moment, Sarah and Tom allowed themselves to hope. Maybe he had taken her and raised her as his own. Maybe she was out there, a teenager now, with no memory of her real parents. It was a fragile, terrifying hope, but it was better than the alternative. The forensic team went back to the attic one more time, convinced they had missed something. They pulled up the floorboards around the nest Arthur had made. Underneath the cardboard mattress, tucked into a crevice between 2 joists, they found his real treasure box. It wasn't a shoebox. It was a small tin lunchbox, the kind a child would carry. The paint was faded, decorated with cartoon characters from a generation ago. Inside was not another stack of photos. It was a collection of trophies. There was a small, pink plastic beret, the kind Lily always wore. Sarah confirmed it was hers. She remembered buying it for her at a local drugstore. There was a single, tiny baby tooth, wrapped in a piece of tissue paper, and there was a child's drawing. It was done in crayon on a piece of notebook paper, depicting a stick-figure girl holding hands with a much taller stick-figure man. Above their heads, the man had written a single word: family. But the most disturbing discovery was a small, spiral-bound notebook. It was his journal. The entries were sparse, written in a cramped, barely legible script. They weren't dated. They were just a stream of consciousness, a window into his twisted mind. He wrote about watching the family. He called them the people below. He described their routines, their conversations he overheard through the floor. He wrote about Lily. He called her the star. He wrote about how she was special, how she was meant for him. He believed he was her rightful guardian, her true father. He was rescuing her, he wrote, from a world that didn't understand her. The journal entries grew more and more delusional. He described his secret visits to her room. He wrote about the games they played, the stories he told her. He had convinced her he was a magical friend, a secret keeper. He told her not to tell her parents because they wouldn't understand their special game. A child's trust, so easily won, so cruelly betrayed. The last entry was chilling. It read, "Tonight, we leave. The star and I. We will go to our forever house. No more hiding. Just family." The entry was not dated, but it was the last one in the book. It was clear he had written it on the night he took her. The hope that she was still alive began to fade, replaced by a cold, hard dread. This wasn't a man who wanted to raise a child. This was a man who wanted to possess a memory. The discovery of the journal and the trophy box shifted the focus of the investigation. The question was no longer if Arthur Hayes took Lily, but what he did next. The phrase, "our forever house," echoed in Detective Miller's mind. It sounded so final, so ominous. It didn't sound like a new beginning. It sounded like an end. He ordered a deep dive into Hayes's known associates and past locations, however transient. There had to be somewhere he considered a home base, a place he might return to. The search led them to a dilapidated property on the outskirts of a rural town 100 miles away. The property had belonged to his parents, who had died years ago, leaving the abandoned farmhouse to their estranged son. He had never officially claimed it, but neighbors reported seeing a man matching his description there, on and off over the years. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead they had. Miller and a team of officers drove out to the property. It was a wreck. The house was collapsing, the windows were boarded up, and the yard was overgrown with weeds that were waist-high. It looked like a place that time had forgotten. It felt like the kind of place someone would go to disappear for good. They pried the boards off the front door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay and damp earth. Every surface was covered in a thick layer of dust and grime. It was clear no one had lived there in a very long time. They searched the house room by room. It was empty, stripped of anything of value. It was a dead end. Miller felt a familiar wave of frustration wash over him. Was this another cold trail? As they were about to leave, one of the younger officers, who was scanning the overgrown backyard, called out. He had found something. Behind a thicket of thorny bushes, almost completely hidden from view, was an old, crumbling storm cellar. The wooden doors were warped and swollen, but not locked. It took 2 officers to pry them open. A wave of cool, musty air rushed out. Miller shone his flashlight down the steep concrete steps into the darkness below. The cellar was small, with stone walls and a dirt floor. It was mostly empty, except for a pile of rotting blankets in the corner and a single, small wooden chair. And on the wall, carved into the soft stone, were hundreds of markings. They were tally marks, scratched into the rock, row after row. Miller walked down the steps, his light tracing the desperate lines. What did they mean? Days? Weeks? Then he saw the other carving. It was at the eye level of a small child sitting in the chair. It was a crudely etched flower, a daisy with 6 petals. Lily used to draw flowers like that on everything. Sarah had shown him her old notebooks. It was her signature doodle. He felt the air leave his lungs. She had been here. She had been kept in this dark, cold cellar. He ran his fingers over the tally marks. The flower. This was her prison. This was the forever house. He looked around the small, dark space. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of what happened next. Just the silent testament of her captivity. The man who had lived in the walls had brought her to a hole in the ground. The hope that she might be found alive was extinguished completely in that dark, silent cellar. The search of the cellar continued, but they found very little else. A few more old food wrappers, a child's shoe half buried in the dirt floor. There was no sign of Arthur Hayes, and no indication of what had happened to Lily after her time in that cellar. Had he moved her again? Or was this the final stop? The tally marks on the wall were counted. There were 93. 93 days. 3 months of her life spent in that dark, underground room. The thought was unbearable. Back at the station, the timeline started to come together. Arthur Hayes had lived in the attic for an unknown number of weeks, grooming and observing Lily. He took her in August of 1992. He brought her to the storm cellar, where he kept her for 3 months. Then, sometime in the late fall, they both vanished. The question of Hayes's own fate was finally answered by a stroke of luck. A cold case detective in another state, hearing about the national news coverage of the Lily case, remembered an old John Doe file. In the winter of 1992, just a few months after Lily disappeared, the body of an unidentified man was found by a river. He had no ID and had died of exposure. The case was never solved. The detective pulled the file, looked at the post-mortem photos, and compared them to the mugshot of Arthur Hayes being broadcast on the news. It was a match. The man who had terrorized a family and stolen a child had died alone, a nameless drifter freezing to death by a riverbank. There was a sense of grim, unsatisfying justice in it. He couldn't hurt anyone else. But he had taken his secrets with him to the grave. He had never told anyone what he did with Lily. There would be no trial, no confession, no final answer. The investigation was officially over. The case was closed. Detective Miller had to make the final call to Sarah and Tom. He told them about the cellar, the tally marks, the flower. He told them that Arthur Hayes was dead. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. It was the sound of the last, thinnest thread of hope finally snapping. The not knowing was a special kind of hell, but it had allowed for a sliver of possibility. Now, the possibility was gone. There would be no reunion. There would be no miraculous return. The story was over. They knew who took her. They knew where he had kept her. They knew he could never be punished for it. But they would never know for sure what happened in the end. They would never be able to bring her home. The police returned the box of Polaroids to Sarah and Tom, thinking it was something they should have. For weeks, they couldn't bring themselves to open it. It sat on their coffee table, a small cardboard coffin of memories. One evening, Tom finally opened the box. He and Sarah sat on their couch and looked through the Polaroids one by one, For the first and last time, they didn't see the pictures as evidence anymore. They saw them as the last moments of their daughter's life captured on film. They saw her smile, and it broke their hearts. It was a real smile. She wasn't always afraid. In some of those moments, she was just a little girl, playing a game, unaware of the monster who was playing with her. They saw the man, Arthur Hayes, in the background, a ghost in their own home. They saw the shadow that had been living above them, the darkness they never knew was there. The photos weren't a comfort. They were a confirmation of their worst nightmare, a detailed account of a betrayal that had happened right under their roof. The man hadn't just stolen their daughter, he had stolen their memories of home, of safety, of her last happy months. He had tainted everything. They stopped at the picture that had first unsettled Mark Peterson, the new homeowner, the one where Lily wasn't smiling. She was looking up at the ceiling, her eyes wide with what they now knew was fear. She was listening. She knew he was up there. And in her eyes, they saw the moment the game had ended for her. The moment she realized her special friend was not a friend at all. That was the last photo they could bear to look at. They put the pictures back in the box, sealed it, and put it away in the back of a closet. A final, painful piece of a story that would never have a true ending. They had an answer, but they would never have peace. The truth hadn't set them free. It had just built a different kind of prison around them, one made of facts and certainties that were even more painful than the years of not knowing. The quiet suburban house on the tree-lined street was eventually sold again. The story of the man in the attic became a local legend, a ghost story whispered to scare children. But for Sarah and Tom, it was never just a story. It was the quiet, tragic reality of a little girl who vanished from her bed, whose last days were spent with a monster she thought was her friend, documented in a series of photographs left behind in the dark. Have you ever heard of a case where the answers were hidden so close to home? Share your thoughts or similar stories in the comments below.